Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Today I have a guest. He's a PhD. He's in a PhD program, and I kind of thought it would be fun to compare and contrast what a Psy.D program versus a PhD program looks like. I know this is something that would have helped me when trying to decide what route to go. So I hope you enjoy. My guest is Zach Bergson. So Zachary, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I discovered your podcast on Spotify. I think the algorithm recommended it to me, and I've enjoyed listening to all your interviews. So,
Oh, good. Well, thank you.
happy.
That's what I've, you're the first person who's kind of, who I've kind of heard feedback from that especially just happened upon the podcast. So that's nice to see it's making its rounds. Yeah.
I listen to a lot of podcasts, so I guess it kind of makes, and podcasts about this topic. So I guess it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, how, would you mind just kind of telling us a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in psychology?
Sure. Yeah. So my route to psychology or clinical psychology, I think, was a little bit circuitous compared to the average person that's in my program. So I don't think I'm old, but I think the compared to the mean age of the people in my program, I'm probably like 5 years older than the average person. So I'm 30, and I actually didn't take a single psychology course in undergrad. I studied public policy and really wanted to become a journalist. And I did that for a little bit, doing like editorial side of journalism. And then I got into the tech side of journalism. I actually worked as a software engineer at the Wall Street Journal.
Oh,
I worked on their charting application that basically makes all of the charts you see on their website and a lot of the charts you see in print.
okay.
And so, like, professionally, up until I got into my PhD program, didn't look like I would end up doing what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
But I guess what got me into it was, so my Zaidi, which is grandpa in Yiddish, he is a clinical psychologist. He went to NYU. So NYU doesn't have a clinical psychology PhD program anymore, but when he was there, that program existed. And he's also a psychoanalyst, and he's like a very important person in my life. A very like intellectually curious man, and he'd always talk about Freud and his work, and I found it to be interesting, but I honestly didn't really consider going into the field until I did some of my own psychotherapy work. I started going to psychotherapy in my like early mid-20s, and I just got really into the whole process, and I started doing a lot of reading in my free time. I read a lot of Freud's works. I read a lot of things in general about psychotherapy, and I realized that I like journalism and I like technology, but the impact that you have is, I like working with people directly, and I like seeing change happen and like having an impact in someone's life. And while those fields can be impactful, it's abstracted away many levels. So this felt like a good area for me to do. And I also really like doing research. So I get to use some of the programming skills that I picked up in my 20s for my own research in my PhD program. So it's all kind of ended up fitting in nicely. Journalism skills, also like just doing skills, very important. So it's all kind of fit together nicely, but it was not a straight path.
Yeah. Similar in some ways. I'm I just turned 31, so I'm a little bit older than some of my peer group. And one of my buddies here, he's a year above me, but he's getting ready to go on internship. But similar to you, he worked in computer programming for like Boeing and stuff. And then he talks about, but he has a love for people and a passion to help people, and he got into clinical psychology for that reason. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when it came time to so PhD, you mentioned, your love of research. You really like researching things. Is that kind of that compared to with the PsyD program being more clinical based? What was that process like?
Yeah. So I had a limitation in the sense that I had to stay in the New York area. It's where my wife is. It's where my wife works, and so I had to stay in the New York area. And I mean, luckily for me, there are a lot of options in the New York area. There's probably an equal amount of PsyD versus PhD. It might actually be more PsyD. And I think what pushed me to not go down the PsyD route was because I really did want to have that strong research element. And I wanted to specifically work with a supervisor who either was into using more like advanced statistical modeling to get at underlying constructs, or a person that was interested in neuroscience, which is another area that I had no training in whatsoever, but I was very interested in it. And there happened to be a amazing supervisor at Yeshiva. His name is Van Seaman, that I'm working with now, who is a visual neuroscientist and kind of just like a math geek kind of too. And I think I wouldn't have gone into the program if it wasn't for him seeing my like programming skills. I think that's probably how I got in. So that's what pushed me to PhD, although I do consider myself to be more psychoanalytic, and the PsyD programs in New York, not all, but especially the PsyD program at Yeshiva, there's a PhD and a PsyD at Yeshiva. It's like way more psychoanalytic. So it wasn't incredibly easy for me to make that decision, but I think at the end of the day, considering my interests, it allowed me more options, essentially.
That makes sense. And so with the PhD program, you mentioned the supervisor. Did you know of him before you applied? And did you already have the neuroscience type of interest before you applied?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part first. So before I did my PhD program, I got an MS in statistical methods, pretty much, at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I did that like while I was working, so it was tough, but it was interesting because they kind of let me take whatever classes I wanted, and there was a few neuroscience classes that I got to take, and one of them was this class called The Neuroscience of Consciousness, and it was co-taught by a philosopher named Richard Brown, who has a really good podcast called Consciousness Live.
Okay.
And a fairly successful neuroscientist named Tony Rowe took that class and some other neuroscience classes, but that particular class made me it drove home, it kind of like connected a lot of interests that I'd had throughout my whole life. And it made me want to not only look at psychology, but also some of the underlying biological mechanisms and how the underlying biological mechanisms can then lead to like a phenomenological experience. So yeah, but my research in my master's program was with the developmental psychologist, and I didn't really have any research to like, show a supervisor who was mainly in the neuroscience field that I would be a good candidate.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful to Vance for like, giving me a chance despite on paper me not really having
Hmm.
that much stuff to back me up. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so did you know about him before you applied to the program?
I didn't know about him. I mean, I was researching programs, and what I did at all the programs was I would, pick out one lab that I was really interested in. At the program that I'm in, they have the model where you apply to the program and you say what your preference in lab is, but you don't necessarily have to stick with that lab once you get there, which I think not it's probably in the minority of clinical psychology PhD programs, but that's how my program was. So I picked out his lab, and I don't think I even wrote to him beforehand. I was which I don't recommend. I was kind of split between a pure research PhD at the CUNY Graduate Center with my supervisor in my master's program, and doing clinical. And I had met with some other supervisors at different schools, but I think I discovered Vance kind of late. I think I discovered his lab maybe like 3 weeks before the application deadline.
Oh.
And I just threw it in, yeah, in a application, not really thinking much of it because I felt like it was a stretch.
Uh-huh.
And I got an interview.
Well,
So I think I got lucky that, my application didn't get, sifted off the stack.
yeah. Cool. When you mentioned labs, is that you mean just like the lab where you do research, like a neuroscience lab, and maybe another, I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that
So we have at my program, I would say that's pretty normal for PhD programs. So my program, we have the visual neuroscience lab, which is the lab I'm in. There is a multiple sclerosis lab. There is a addictions lab. There's a neuropsychology / movement disorder lab. A lab that focuses on comorbidities between diabetes and mental health issues, comorbidities between asthma and mental health issues. So each of these supervisors or faculty members basically have their own research projects that are often funded by, $1 million NIH grants. And students will apply to work with those particular people, and they usually stay at my program. Some people switch, but they usually end up staying with the person that they initially started with.
Oh, okay, that's cool. That's interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but with PhD, if you get accepted, is the schooling basically paid for throughout your time?
So it depends on the program. So my program is only partially funded.
Okay.
And part of the reason why, so it's partially funded, but since each supervisor typically has access to grant money, usually what happens is a lot of students will either like break even, or they'll only be paying a little bit, and then we'll have like there are like teaching positions that they offer us and give us like small stipends. So you end up in my program, you still end up taking out student loans, but it probably might be, I mean, it's definitely not more than a Psy.D program. It's typically less. And then there are some PhD programs that are way more research focused. So an example of that is Stony Brook University, which is out in Long Island. And that's like one of the top like clinical research programs. And all the students there get fully funded. And, but the sort of the catch with that is that a lot of those students, the clinical training is, it's not that they get bad clinical training at those programs. It's just, it's not emphasized as much. So it's maybe more like 70-30 in favor of research or 60-40 in favor of research. Whereas my program, the way that they talk about it, it's more like 50-50.
Okay.
So I guess like the more competitive PhD programs, they're all competitive, but the really, really competitive ones are the ones that are fully funded and are like thought of as like clinical research or like clinical science programs, whereas mine is a scientist practitioner model. So there's a lot more emphasis on clinical work than the clinical science program. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. I think mine, I might get this wrong, but so I go to Regent University in Virginia Beach, and I think we're considered practitioner scholar model. And it's probably like either like 80% clinical, 20% research, or 70-30. It's really independent upon the individual. You can be really involved with research, and you can do a whole lot of research. Some of the people I know, they've gotten comments upon interviewing for internships saying like, wow, for a PsyD program, you've got a lot of research experience. And then others, they just basically do their dissertation, and that's all the research they do, you know? Yeah.
I mean, there are some people in my program where they are mainly clinical focused, but a lot of the hoops that you have to jump through to get your PhD require you to do the more research than you would in a PsyD program just by default. And then there are some people that are way more research focused, and that's their goal. And a lot of times those people will stay the extra year. They'll stay the 6th year or like the 5th year before internship, because they want to beef up their CV to get all those competitive positions.
Yeah. Okay. What did let's see, what was kind of like what's a summary of your first year? What did that look like?
My first year, so I don't know what it's like inside. I'd be curious to hear what you say, but because my program is trying to do so much, they're trying to give you really good clinical training and also really good research training. In the first year, they really, really load you up with courses. And technically in your second semester, you start in our like university community clinic, but a lot of people don't get assigned patients until the summer between their first and second year. So the first and second year, I think you take it's either 5 or 6 classes each semester, and we'll have a cognitive assessment, comp exam, and then a personality comp exam in the first 2 semesters as well. So it was pretty intense, and it was all over Zoom for me because of COVID, which I think made the cognitive assessment course harder because it's hard to do like block design over Zoom. But our professors, I think, especially the cognitive assessment professor, really, Dr. Sang, she put in a lot of work to make it so that we didn't lose out. So I felt like I was trained really well there.
Good.
But it was hard over Zoom because we didn't have the community. We didn't have our get to bond in the suffering of all of the classes that we were taking and the craziness. So we had WhatsApp channels, and you got to know some people, talk to them privately, but it was definitely like a little isolating that year. Yeah.
Yeah, that's rough. The first year that's when you solidify and you become cohesive and you form relationships and stuff. So man, doing it over Zoom, that would have our first year, it was our first semester, we also had maybe 5 classes, and one of them was intelligence testing, where we learned IQ testing. And then the next semester was personality, where we learned like the MMPI and stuff like that. And for each of those classes, we had a probe where it's basically you test out on the material, like a performance-based.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you get below a certain percentage, you get one attempt to retake it. Right. And then if you fail again, then you have to repeat the course.
Yeah.
So those were like really stressful classes for a lot of people. And a lot of people during those first 2 semesters, they're either like, I didn't understand that we were going to have to do a lot of assessment. I didn't think that that's what this was going to be about. And then they either drop out or they fail out of those because they're not. Some people are just, it seems like people who are more research focused also tend to like testing more or assessment.
Yeah. And
so people who don't really have that type of mentality, I think, also don't do as well. So that's always, they front load it and it almost like weeds out the. Yeah.
One of the professors in the first semester, apparently we didn't get this because they felt bad for us because we were on Zoom. So they tried to be extra nice to us. But apparently one of the professors at my program gives a speech every year about how at least like 1 or 2 people in in your cohort is going to fail and be like kicked out of the program or leave because it's too much. So my cohort didn't get it because they felt bad for us, but apparently in all the other years, this particular professor gives that speech, and it sounds pretty scary. I'm happy I didn't.
Yeah, we didn't get this speech, but I remember because our cohorts are how many people were in your cohort?
I think there are like 16 people in my cohort.
Oh, that's pretty big for PhD, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we maybe average around 21, 22 people coming in to the first year each year. And no professor talked to us about it, but we usually ask the cohorts above us, and they would say, you're probably going to lose, 3, 4, 5 people throughout the time. Yeah. And then for us in the summer, we had they called it like a boot camp training. Like we have a summer class that prepares us for, here on campus, we have a psychological services center where during you start the fall of your second year, that's like your first placement, and you work at the psychological services center, and you do therapy and assessment for people in the community at a discounted price.
Right.
So in the summer, at the end of our first year in the summer, you do training to prepare you for seeing clients for the first time. So yeah, for us, it's the beginning of the second year. For that full year, you're at the psychological services center plus taking classes, but that's when you start seeing clients.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and for you said a lot of you guys at the end of your first year, like maybe the summer of your first year, you already start seeing people.
Yeah. So a lot of us, I know some PhD programs, they don't have you start your first externship or seeing patients until 2 years in. Because I think they want you to be more focused on the research. But my program, they start us really early. We start a practicum class our second semester, and technically you can get assigned a patient in your second semester. I think maybe out of the 16 people in my cohort, only like 3 or 4 got someone assigned to them in their second semester of their first year.
Wow.
But by July or August of like in between your first and second year, you get assigned three patients, and you start your externship. Usually, I mean, I started my externship in June, between my first and second year. So I had some clinical experience going in. I didn't mention this earlier, but I worked at a psychiatric recovery clinic
Okay.
for almost 2 years before I started my PhD program, on top of my master's program and my full-time job.
Wow.
I wanted to have some clinical work on my resume. So I was working maybe like, I don't know, 5 hours a week there. So it wasn't that much, but it was something. So I don't think I was that nervous going in, but it still is pretty nerve-wracking. You know, they kind of, they just throw you
Yeah.
in there. You sink or swim. I mean, we have like supervision and stuff, but yeah, that it's kind of I think in a lot of programs in New York, regardless of Psy.D, Ph.D, tend to start earlier if they're more clinical heavy.
Oh,
They just throw you in there.
wow.
So yeah, I don't really know what, like, there's probably a calculus for like getting a certain number of clinical hours, and maybe they decide, well, we need our students to have X amount of clinical hours by the time they apply to intern, so we might as well start them early. I'm not sure if it's that or if it's a philosophy thing. They just feel like you should just start. I'm not sure why they do that. Yeah.
And is that on campus? Do you guys have like a psychological services center?
Yeah, so our program, I think the coolest thing about our program is that we have a psychiatric outpatient clinic in the Bronx,
Oh,
kind of like what you're saying. So at your program, that serves the community around you.
uh-huh.
And I think compared to some of my peers at externship who see a lot of undergraduates, it's interesting because you really, you see the types of patients that you would see if you were working at, just a general outpatient clinic in the community, or a like state hospital. I mean, people are they'll never give you someone that would require inpatient treatment right away, but I've had a few patients in our outpatient clinic that had been hospitalized previously. So I guess the patient population tends to be like riskier than some of my peers that I've talked to at my externship. So I think, and a lot of underlying personality disorder too, like way more than you would get the typical training clinic. So I'd say it can be hard and a little scary for people because you start off pretty intensely, but I think it really teaches you what this work is like, and especially in clinical psychology, it gives you an idea of what your job is going to be like.
Yeah. Similarly, we would basically our first session with a client, we would do like a diagnostic interview and find out what they're coming in for, and then we would send over an email or a note to our supervisor, and then they would say whether or not we can accept them based on based on our level of training or experience. And but there were even with that process, there was still a lot of maybe severe cases that came through during our time. So that was, and it is kind of like, oh, okay, so this is here we go, like here we are. Yeah. And so that for our whole second year, that was I forget how many hours we had to have, but we had to have a certain amount of therapy hours, and then we had to have, I think, 3 different assessment clients that we did a full battery on. So for your guys' second year, did you stay at that center, or did you guys have an external Practica site?
So we, in our second year in my program, we do concurrent the outpatient clinic at our university and an external site.
Oh,
So that second year is the hardest year in our program by far because you take 2 to 3 classes each semester. You have 3 to 4 patients in the outpatient clinic that's associated with their university, and then you have the external
man.
practicum site. So you end up getting typically somewhere between, like, I think on paper you're supposed to only have 20 hours a week, but it kind of, sometimes maybe it evens out at the end, but I've had weeks in my ship where I'm working more like 24 hours. And then there are some weeks where it's slower. So there are times where I was almost not quite full time, but working a little bit more than half time, and then also doing my research and also doing class and like comprehensive exams. It's just, yeah, it's a very hard year, and I'm happy to be through it.
Well, congratulations. That's a lot. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think similarly, I think during our second and third year, it's been 16 to 20 hours a week is our kind of contract. So yeah, it sounds similar there. What was your external site? Where did you get experience at?
Yeah, I was at the Rehabilitation Institute, and I was working on a brain injury unit there.
Oh,
So yeah, so I was doing I'm actually still there, but I'm doing 50% neuropsych testing and then 50% psychotherapy.
oh,
So the neuropsych testing, it's pretty brief. The testing's like an hour and a half because the patients typically have pretty severe brain injuries. They can't sit through like a 8-hour testing. So an hour and a half testing to basically help with treatment planning for their outpatient treatment, sort of help the OTs and speech therapists figure out what they should be working on when they're out in the community doing the follow-up outpatient treatment. And then the psychotherapy, I do a bit of bedside psychotherapy. So I'll meet with a patient for 15 to 30 minutes, depending on what's going on. And then I do some outpatient psychotherapy in our outpatient clinic at Kessler as well. So that's just like traditional psychotherapy.
Yeah.
So it's very, very interesting site.
Yeah, that does sound very interesting. And I'm surprised. I didn't think you guys. It's interesting to learn how much experience you guys get with therapy and like being 50-50 at the site. Yeah, I'm surprised to hear that.
It's not. I'm not sure that all rehab sites are like that. I think I'm hoping it's changing because it really is important. It's one's mental health really has big determinants on your functional outcome, especially because there sometimes are changes in personality where maybe personality hasn't changed per se, but like maybe some of the worst parts of someone's personality gets amplified after they have a stroke or a TBI. And then they have conflicts with family members. They have a lot of self-esteem issues. So it's really, I think it's very helpful for people, but because people that are recovering from brain injuries are already meeting many providers, I think a lot of sites just don't prioritize it, which is a shame because I think that it is an area of treatment that I think clinical psychologists are particularly able to help in, because we do have the assessment training. We're not biologically trained, but we have a little bit of the biological training as well.
Yeah.
And we're the ones getting exposed to that. I could be totally off base here, but it's my understanding that most social workers and most mental health counseling people don't get the chance to work with people from this population, or it's not as common, or maybe they're working in like more of a case manager role and not a psychotherapist role. So I feel like it's an area that could really use more people, but I think it's a different, it can feel different because the people are, they're not as high functioning. Or, I mean, that's not true across the board, but a lot of people are not as high functioning as your typical outpatient person, or even inpatient patient.
Yeah. That's something I have never really considered, and I've never worked with that population. I recently spoke with a clinical psychologist who's working at a rehab facility in Florida, and she that was only maybe a month ago, and she was very informative. And I was just, I'm still amazed as I talk with more and more people about how many different roles a clinical psychologist can have, and thinking about not just, like you said, not just doing neuropsychological testing, but then all of the implications that come with that type of an injury or that type of a disorder, and how that's going to impact you and your lifestyle and your family, and how mental health has an impact on your physical health, and just so that's so cool. Good.
Yeah, thanks.
That's a good experience. When is it that you mentioned you're already starting to do, are you starting to already do research for your dissertation as well?
Yeah, so I have all of the data for my dissertation collected from a clinical trial that, like a phase of a clinical trial that already was completed.
Okay.
And so I have the data, but I'm also working on the next phase of the clinical trial. So although I'm not going to use that data for my dissertation, it's the same procedures, the same treatments essentially. So the hope is, so right now we're in, I think the first funding was pilot funding. So the sample size was fairly small. I think it was maybe around 30 people. And now we're hoping to get a larger sample size, hopefully around 100. And if the effect size, this particular intervention we're trying to tailor, is successful, then we'll get more funding for an even bigger trial. And at that point, if it works out, then it might end up being something that people use to treat schizophrenia. But it's very much in the beginning phases, and it's very exploratory. And I think it has a good shot, but you never know with these things.
Yeah. Can you go ahead and tell anyone who's listening what your dissertation is on?
Sure. Yeah. So as I was saying earlier, my supervisor is a visual neuroscientist, and he's been working on this visual remediation study up at, so right now it's at University of Rochester Medical and Cornell Westchester. And essentially what they're doing is there are a bunch of brain, I'll call them brain games, but it's not like the brain games that you download on in the Apple Store. The games are very boring. Like, these are not games that you would want to download for fun, where you have to basically discriminate certain stimuli in your visual field on the computer screen. And they do these trainings over, the course of, I think it's over the course of like 12 weeks or so, or longer. And we are also collecting cognitive data at the same time. And essentially what we're trying to do is, we believe that there are certain pathways in the brain that are connected to vision that are not functioning properly for people with psychotic disorders. What we believe is that people with psychotic disorders have deficits in gain control in their brain, which means that they're either not filtering out enough information and they're being overstimulated, or the opposite, where they're getting so little information that they're almost in a state that you would be in when you're on like, similar to like being on ketamine or something, where you're like dissociating to the point where like there's so little stimulation that you have to like confabulate or attribute things from your mind to what's going on in the world.
Oh.
And it's all connected to the visual system. And this visual training that we're doing, our pilot data showed that it had a fairly significant effect in strengthening those pathways. We've also, our collaborator out in, I think he's in UC Riverside or something, he has done this training with people in a healthy population. He actually did it with a group of baseball players, and they found that their ability to hit the ball was improved after doing these visual trainings. So we have some evidence from other populations that this is a significant effect, but we haven't really tried it with people with psychotic disorders. And the hope is that if we can strengthen these pathways, we can improve some of the negative and cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia, which our current medications don't really target. Right now, they only target the positive symptoms for the most part, except for maybe clozapine. But most of them are all about the hallucinations. They don't really even get at the delusions. So we're hoping that our treatment will improve some of those areas that are affected by schizophrenia that current biological techniques can't help with. So could help with like, social cognition, stuff like that, processing speed, all types of things. It's very much in the early stages. It could end up being a dud, but there's some promising data.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I was just talking with my wife, I think yesterday, about because when you mentioned it could be too little information, and so they're trying to fill in what's missing.
Yeah.
We were talking about dissociation and how your brain, even visually, you have a blind spot, but your brain fills in what should be there.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I mean, we all kind of, our brains do this. Like, we're not actually seeing the information that's coming in. Our brain will, like, if you stare at a really bright light, the gain control in your brain will basically prevent you from seeing all of that data. All of that data would be overwhelming to your system. So like, it's not a one-to-one thing. And this is actually the thing that really got me excited about joining my supervisor's lab. I read this article shortly before I interviewed with him for the PhD program about how there's a single case of someone with congenital blindness later developing schizophrenia. There's not a single case in history of someone who was blind later becoming schizophrenic or psychotic, which is like completely mind-blowing to me, and tells you that there's something with the visual system, or the lack of you using the visual system in the way that it was traditionally meant to be used, that is contributing to psychotic disorders.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool. And
Yeah.
I hope to like maybe get involved with like looking at that a little bit more, but it's like very, very, very interesting to me.
Yeah, fascinating. That sounds like a great line of research you've come across. That's cool. I'm excited to read some of your articles one day.
Yeah, don't hold your breath. It takes so long. It takes so long to write these are. It's insane. It's just it's wild the amount of work that goes into stuff. But I'll send you the article once, or some of the articles once once they come out.
Yeah. I forgot. I was gonna ask about when it comes to you guys choosing external Practica sites, like the rehab center that you're at. Do you have a pretty long list or like a pretty good variety of different places that you can apply to, or is it kind of scarce, or do you? Yeah.
So in the New York area, I think there's a paradox of choice because we are like the psychiatric capital of America, maybe the world, I don't know. So there are so many options, but they're not all good options. And some sites won't take people from my program because we're primarily CBT, and then other programs won't take people from the psychoanalytic programs because they don't want psychoanalytic people. There are some sites that just have bad reputations, and our clinical supervisor is like, no, I will not let you go there. You're not allowed to go there. So I think that when you whittle that down, it's still probably more than the average PhD or PsyD student around the country, but it's not like I can apply to everything. There are certain that are huge no-nos, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, for us, I think probably around 12 sites that we can choose from. And there's like 2 inpatient psychiatric hospitals. There's another short-term psychiatric hospital. There's some private practices.
Yeah.
And maybe 2 or 3 neuropsyc testing sites.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where are you heading this next year, upcoming year?
Yeah, I'm going to Cornell Westchester. I was actually just up there getting my medical clearance, but I'm working on the psychotic disorders unit there, and I'm also doing some of the research that I was talking about. So I think the average stay of a patient on the unit is like, I think only maybe 2 to 3 weeks. So it's fairly brief, and I think there's also a partial hospitalization program that we are involved in as well. So, it's definitely briefer, and we do a combination. I'll be doing a lot of neuropsych testing, and I'll be doing some group therapy, brief psychotherapy. I'll be doing and the orientations of the people there are very eclectic. There are some people like Michael Garrett, who you interviewed, who I'm not sure if he's still doing it, but in years past he ran a group supervision group at that site. So I'm really hoping he's there.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Sorry, I got.
Oh, you're good.
New York City. Just wait. Yeah, so I'm hoping he's still there because I actually listened to that podcast twice because he's really he's got a lot of wisdom to offer.
Yeah.
You have to read his book. So I would be really excited to learn from him. But we also do a lot of social skills training, which is a big thing for people with schizophrenia. There's some cognitive remediation therapy as well, which I feel like the social skills training and the cognitive remediation therapy probably go hand in hand, but we'll see. So yeah, it's gonna be interesting.
What is cognitive remediation therapy?
So cognitive remediation therapy it can be done actually by speech therapists or psychologists. Basically what you do is you do certain training, certain games that are supposed to improve your cognition and your problem solving skills. So an example of what you would do is okay, so you're standing with the patient in front of a shelf and you're trying to stimulate a work environment, and you say, okay, we need to get all the materials we need to write, take notes in a meeting. What do you need? And on the shelf, you'll have a notebook, some pens, some pencils, some things that you don't need. And you'll do things like, you'll have them pick out the things they need. You'll talk to them and do some training on, how to handle difficulties with memory. So a lot of people with brain injuries and also people with schizophrenia have difficulties with verbal memory. So you'll teach them compensatory skills to manage some of those deficits. So a big thing that they do is calendar training. They teach them how to keep a calendar, when to refer to the calendar, teaching them to remember, to remember, stuff like that. I've never actually done it, so I might be getting some of the bits and pieces wrong, but that's like the general gist of it. I think there's a little bit of controversy in the field about whether or not it actually helps, or like if it actually translates to like general skills. I think there are some people in the research that say that you're basically teaching people to be good at that particular task. And those skills aren't necessarily transferring to the world. But I think there's probably an equal amount of people with data showing the opposite. So I'm not really sure what's right and what's wrong, but it is something that some of my patients at Kessler anecdotally have benefited from.
Okay.
So, I think it's a worthy endeavor. I'm not sure. I imagine people with schizophrenia, it is a little bit different, but, schizophrenia as you get older very much looks like a neurocognitive disorder more than like a pure psychiatric disorder. So I imagine that some of the cognitive decline will look somewhat like the cognitive decline you would see from someone who had like, a pretty serious stroke, or someone who was in a really bad car accident, had a TBI. So I'm not 100% sure what it's going to look like yet.
Yeah. But regardless, it sounds like, again, you're going to get a lot of really good experience there. The place I'm heading to is also, it's maybe about a week, like 2 weeks stay for psychiatric patients, either coming in because they were suicidal and they had to be kept, or because they have been in some type of a drug-related incident or overdosed or something like that.
Right.
And they have psychiatrists on site, but us Psy.D students go in like 3 times a week, and we do therapy sessions with them. And then we're going to get some experience with group therapy as well. And I think there's even some cases where we can go to court and kind of observe the forensic side of things.
Interesting.
Yeah. So then after this year, this would be your 3rd year.
Yeah.
And then for your 4th year, is that basically going on internship? What is 4th year?
4th year, I'll do my last externship, and I'll basically be writing my dissertation.
Okay.
Theoretically, I'm actually going to be done with classes after my 3rd year. So theoretically, I could apply to internship, but I care too much about my research to do that. Like I really want to get a lot of my research published. I want to finish my dissertation before I start internship, because it seems not fun to be working on your dissertation while on internship. So basically going to spend that year doing the next externship that I get, wherever that will be, and writing my dissertation.
Yeah, similar here. It's I think a pretty good majority of people finish their dissertation either on internship, probably while they're on internship. But the way we're trying to get it done is I would like to defend before I go on internship, if possible. Yeah.
It seems much better for your sanity.
Yeah.
Having like 2 jobs at once.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, so it's interesting. I've enjoyed this because yeah, I had no idea other than before this conversation, my impression of a PhD program was just more, it was just my, I had just a word would pop into my head and it's like research, and that's about it. So,
And it could be, if you're talking to someone from Stony Brook or another clinical science program, I think maybe it would look a lot like that. But my program is, I think most scientist practitioner programs are somewhat like mine. They try to at least make it close to equivalent between research and clinical.
yeah, that's good. That's cool. Where do you see yourself kind of heading either? Yeah, maybe like after internship, where do you?
Yeah, I'm not 100% certain. I don't think that me and my wife are going to stay in the New York area. We'll probably leave. I think it depends on how much I like research. I'm hoping that either way, if the project that I'm on is successful, I'll be able to like bring it with me or be able to start up like another arm of it elsewhere. But I'm not certain that I'll be able to do that and whether or not I'll have the patience for research. I mean, I have the patience now, but there are times where I'm like, I clinical work. Why am I doing this? So we'll see. We'll see if my patience wears thin in a few years. But either way, I definitely want to be doing a lot of clinical work, even if research stays in my life. And I think I want to work with severe mental illness. I mean, I really like working on the brain injury unit. It's not quite severe mental illness, although I've had a lot of patients with morbid problems like schizophrenia or past suicide history, personality disorder. So I think I want to continue working with severe mental illness. I also feel like for my last externship, I want to try to do a forensic site with people who also have severe mental illness. So I'm interested in maybe getting one of the externships at the various prisons / jails in the New York area. So that might be something I'll try out. So I'm not 100% besides the fact that I think I want to do severe mental illness and I like being in a position where I could be curious all the time. And, yeah.
Do you have a preference over either assessment or therapy?
Definitely have a preference for therapy, although I do really like assessment. I think my issue with assessment is that you sometimes, you write the report, you find something out about someone, and then you don't see what happens after that. And then you send them off into the world, and sometimes the assessment can be really therapeutic, and you can see the change that you've made in someone's life just by doing the assessment. But I feel like I've probably done close to 50 neuropsych assessments at this point, and probably only like 10% of them that was the case, if not less. And there's just something about that long relationship where you see someone change. Even the brief psychotherapy, if you're seeing someone like 6 times over a 2-week stay, you can see a little bit of change, and that's what I really like. So I think the assessment's important because we're the only ones that do assessment. Psychiatrists don't do it. Workers don't do it. And I think it's like a really valuable thing to know. And it makes us special, but I would never want to be a neuropsychologist. It's a hard road. Very hard road. Yeah. A lot of people in my program, I'd say almost half the people in my program want to be neuropsychologists.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I know it's a kind of a big up and coming, exciting thing for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's cool too. And not that they make like huge bucks, but they do make a lot of money to other people in the mental health field. So I don't know if that's important to you, that that field is fairly lucrative and also really interesting. I just think that I like that long-term relationship and
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Okay. I think that's about our time. I want to thank you again for joining me. It's been a pleasure and an honor. So thanks for having this conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I hope this was interesting
Yeah.
for you and your viewers.
Yeah. I'm sure it will be. And it was for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.